The Last Devil of Damascus. On February 7, 1979, a man wades into the warm waters off a beach in Bertioga, Brazil. He's 67 years old, swimming alone in the afternoon sun. Within minutes, he suffers a massive stroke. His body goes limp. He slips beneath the surface, water fills his lungs, and Josef Mengele, the angel of death, drowns in the gentle surf of the Atlantic Ocean. No pain, no terror, no desperate gasping for air that never comes. Just silence. This monster, responsible for the deaths of thousands, received the kind of peaceful end he systematically denied to the children he tortured. This is his story, and I warn you now, it's going to be hard to stomach. Before we continue, if you appreciate deep dives into history's darkest chapters, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Now, let's talk about how an ordinary boy became history's most sadistic doctor. On March 16, 1911, in the quiet Bavarian town of Günzburg, Germany, a child takes his first breath. Josef Mengele enters a world that gives no indication of the horror he will inflict. His father Karl owns a farm equipment manufacturing company. The family is wealthy, respected, deeply Catholic. Young Joseph excels in school. He's bright, articulate, curious about the world. His teachers describe him as intelligent and ambitious. He plays with other children. He attends church. He helps in his father's factory during summer breaks. Nothing suggested he would become the man who would inject chemicals into children's eyes while they screamed. He pursues his education with genuine passion, earning a doctorate in anthropology from Munich University in 1935, then a second doctorate in medicine from Frankfurt University in 1938. He's drawn to the emerging field of genetics. He studies under Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a leading researcher in hereditary biology and twin studies. This is where the seeds are planted. This is where legitimate science begins its grotesque transformation into something monstrous. But here's what's critical to understand. Germany's humiliation after World War I, the economic devastation of the Weimar Republic, the rise of nationalist fervor, these conditions created an environment. They didn't create Josef Mengele. He wasn't conscripted into the Nazi Party. He joined voluntarily in 1937. He wasn't drafted into the SS. He applied in 1938. He chose this path. He chose to believe that some human beings were worth less than others. He chose to accept the pseudoscience of racial hierarchy. He chose, again and again and again, to embrace an ideology that would give him permission to do things that would have horrified him just years before. Or perhaps, disturbingly, it revealed what was already there, dormant, waiting for permission. Mengele serves briefly on the Eastern Front, earning the Iron Cross for pulling wounded soldiers from a burning tank. He's wounded himself, declared unfit for combat duty. This is 1942, and the SS needs doctors, not healers, not men bound by the Hippocratic Oath. They need men willing to use human beings as laboratory specimens. And Josef Mengele, with his 2 doctorates and his passionate interest in genetics and twin studies, is the perfect candidate. In May 1943, he receives his assignment, Auschwitz-Birkenau. For the first time in his life, Josef Mengele has real power. Absolute, unquestioned, godlike power over hundreds of thousands of human beings who have been stripped of every right, every dignity, every protection. He's 32 years old. He's educated. He's cultured. He speaks multiple languages. He can discuss philosophy and music and the latest scientific developments, and he's about to become something that defies comprehension. Picture the scene, the railway platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Cattle cars arriving day and night, the doors sliding open, families stumbling out, confused, terrified, clutching their few possessions, the air thick with the smell of burning flesh from the crematoria, SS guards screaming orders, dogs barking, chaos and noise and fear, and there, standing calmly on the platform, immaculately dressed in his SS uniform, boots gleaming, is Dr. Josef Mengele. He's conducting what they call selections. With a flick of his finger, he sends people to the gas chambers or to slave labor. Left means death within hours. Right means death from starvation and exhaustion within months. But he's looking for something else. He's looking for twins. He's looking for people with physical abnormalities, dwarfs, people with different colored eyes, anyone who might serve his research into heredity and racial classification. Vera Kriegel, a survivor, later testifies that Mengele would whistle opera as he selected thousands for death. He'd smile. He'd occasionally make jokes with other SS officers. This wasn't a burden to him. This wasn't something he did with reluctance or moral struggle. Witnesses consistently described the same thing. He appeared to enjoy it. When twins arrived, Mengele would approach with genuine enthusiasm. "Twins! Twins!" he'd call out in multiple languages. Mothers, terrified and confused, sometimes stepped forward, thinking this meant their children would be spared. They were right, in a sense. Their children wouldn't go to the gas chambers immediately. Instead, they'd be taken to Block 10, the experimental barracks. And what happened there reveals something about human evil that most people can barely process. Let's talk about Eva and Miriam Moses, 10-year-old twins from Romania. They arrive at Auschwitz in 1944. Mengele spots them immediately. They're taken to the children's barracks in the medical experiment section. For the first few days, they're treated relatively well, fed better than other prisoners, given their own beds. This won't last. This is just preparation for what's coming. Mengele injects Eva with an unknown substance. Within days, she develops a massive fever. Her limbs swell grotesquely. She drifts in and out of consciousness. A doctor examining her tells Mengele she has 2 weeks to live, maximum. Mengele's response? He tells the doctor, "That's too bad. She has a twin." See, for the experiments to have value, both twins need to survive long enough for comparison. If one dies prematurely from the experiment itself, the data is ruined. Eva, through sheer force of will, survives. But here's what makes this particularly horrifying. Mengele was simultaneously taking blood from Miriam, massive quantities, draining her repeatedly to see how blood loss affected one twin versus the other. He was using these children as matched sets for comparison. Living, breathing, terrified little girls became nothing more than data points. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. This was a medical doctor, a man who had taken an oath to do no harm, systematically torturing children in the name of science that had no scientific value whatsoever. The eye experiments. Let that sink in for a moment. Mengele was obsessed with eye color, with the genetics of the Aryan ideal of blue eyes. He would strap children down and inject dyes directly into their eyes, attempting to change brown eyes to blue. No anesthesia. The children would scream. Their eyes would swell, become infected, sometimes rupture entirely, leaving them blind. Mengele would observe, take notes, and move on to the next child. One survivor, a physician named Dr. Miklos Niisli, was forced to assist Mengele in his work. He later testified about an experiment where Mengele sewed 2 Romani twins together, back to back, attempting to create conjoined twins artificially. The children's wounds became gangrenous. They screamed for days until they died from infection. Mengele expressed mild disappointment that the experiment failed, but showed no remorse for the suffering he caused. Here's what you need to understand. These weren't experiments in any legitimate scientific sense. Real medical research requires ethical protocols, controlled conditions, peer review, reproducible results. Mengele's work had none of this. He was torturing people to satisfy his curiosity and his ego, nothing more. The data he collected was useless, methodologically flawed, ethically indefensible, and scientifically worthless. But he didn't just experiment. He also participated in the regular operations of the camp. He personally sent over 400,000 people to their deaths through his selections. He didn't just point. He actively participated in the murder process. When the gas chambers were overcrowded, he would personally inject phenol directly into prisoners' hearts. He would watch them die. Some survivors report that he seemed to study their faces as the life left their eyes. Dr. Ella Lingens, an Austrian doctor imprisoned at Auschwitz, later testified that even hardened SS officers found Mengele disturbing. She recalled one SS man saying, "That man Mengele is so obsessed with his work that he seems to have lost all human feelings." Let that sink in. An SS officer at Auschwitz, a man participating in industrial-scale genocide, found Josef Mengele's behavior disturbing. There's a specific incident that reveals the depth of his sadism. A group of Roma families had been kept alive in a separate section of Auschwitz for months. On August 2, 1944, Mengele ordered the entire Gypsy family camp liquidated. Approximately 4,300 men, women and children were gassed that night. But before they were sent to the gas chambers, Mengele went to the children's barracks. He brought candy and chocolates. He played with the children. He sang songs with them. Then he personally supervised their murder hours later. What kind of person does this? What kind of person plays with children, gains their trust, then sends them to their deaths? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. Evil isn't always the cackling villain of fiction. Sometimes it's the educated, cultured man who loves classical music and can discuss philosophy, who then goes to work and commits atrocities. As the Soviet army advanced from the east in late 1944, the Germans began evacuating Auschwitz. Mengele had kept meticulous records of his experiments, boxes and boxes of documentation. He packed them carefully, prioritizing his research notes over his own personal belongings. These documents, representing the torture and death of thousands, were more valuable to him than anything else. In January 1945, as Auschwitz was liberated, Mengele fled west with the retreating German forces. He was briefly captured by American forces, but without proper identification, he was released. Think about that. The angel of death was literally in Allied custody, and they let him go because they didn't know who he was. He lived in Germany under an assumed name until 1949. Then, with the help of the network of former SS officers and Nazi sympathizers, he escaped to South America. First to Argentina, where he lived quite openly under his own name. Argentina, under Juan Perón, was a haven for Nazi war criminals. Mengele established himself as a carpenter, living a modest but peaceful life. But the world hadn't forgotten. The hunt for Nazi war criminals intensified in the 1950s and 60s. The Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, began actively pursuing Mengele. They successfully captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960, and Mengele became their next target. But he'd already fled to Paraguay, then to Brazil, always one step ahead. Here's the thing that makes his escape particularly galling. Mengele lived for 34 years after Auschwitz was liberated, 3.5 decades. He celebrated birthdays. He swam in the ocean. He made friends. He complained about minor inconveniences like everyone else. Meanwhile, the children he'd tortured, the few who survived, lived with nightmares, with the physical and psychological scars of what he'd done to them. Eva Moses Kaur, one of the Moses twins who survived Mengele's experiments, spent decades tracking him. She wanted him brought to justice. She wanted to look him in the eye and ask him why. She wanted him to be forced to confront what he'd done. She never got that chance. In 1985, German police acting on new intelligence located Mengele's grave in Brazil. He'd been buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. Forensic examination of the remains, including DNA testing, confirmed the identity. Josef Mengele had died 6 years earlier on that beach in Bertioga, having never faced trial, never been forced to answer for his crimes, never expressed a moment of remorse. The survivors were devastated, not because they wanted him to suffer necessarily, but because they wanted justice. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted the world to officially recognize what had been done to them. His peaceful death denied them that. Here's where we enter morally complex territory. Some argue that Mengele's death by stroke was too merciful, that a man who tortured children deserved to experience the terror and pain he inflicted. Others believe that the rule of law, the very thing that separates civilization from barbarism, requires that even monsters receive fair trials and humane treatment, that to become like our enemies in pursuit of justice is to lose what we're fighting for. But here's what's undeniable. Josef Mengele died peacefully while thousands of his victims died in agony. He spent 3 decades swimming, eating, sleeping, while survivors woke up screaming from nightmares about him. He lived to 67, while the children he murdered never saw their 11th birthdays. The mathematical inequality of it is staggering. Consider Zvi the sailor, one of the dwarfs Mengele experimented on. Mengele extracted bone marrow from Zvi's spine without anesthesia, leaving him in agony for weeks. Zvi survived the war, but lived with chronic pain until his death. Josef Mengele never experienced consequences for what he did to Zvi, never apologized, never even acknowledged it happened. Consider the twins he injected with typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases to study disease progression in genetically identical subjects. Many died horrible deaths from infections Mengele deliberately gave them. Those who survived carried physical and psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, Mengele lived comfortably in Brazil, complaining in letters to friends about the heat and his financial difficulties. The disparity is obscene. But here's the deeper question. What does Josef Mengele's story reveal about human nature? He wasn't born evil. He wasn't mentally ill in any clinical sense. Psychiatric evaluations during his time as an SS doctor showed him to be intelligent, rational, and in full control of his faculties. He made choices, conscious and deliberate, to inflict suffering on helpless people. His education didn't prevent this. His cultural sophistication didn't prevent this. His religious upbringing didn't prevent this. In fact, one could argue that his scientific training gave him the tools to be more systematically cruel than he might otherwise have been. He could rationalize his actions as research, as advancing human knowledge, even as he was doing things that advanced nothing except human suffering. This is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt wrote about, but it's also something more. Mengele wasn't just following orders. He volunteered for this work. He was enthusiastic about it. Survivors consistently describe him as energetic, even cheerful, as he committed atrocities. This wasn't reluctant compliance with an evil system. This was active, willing participation in evil for its own sake. What happened to Mengele's victims, the ones who survived? Eva Moses Kaur dedicated her life to Holocaust education, speaking at schools and universities until her death in 2019. She advocated for forgiveness, not for Mengele's sake, but for her own peace of mind. She said holding on to hatred was giving Mengele power over her even after his death. Miriam Moses, her twin, struggled with the long-term health effects of Mengele's experiments for her entire life. She died in 1993 from cancer that doctors believed was related to the injections and treatments she received as a child. Even decades later, Mengele was still killing. The German government eventually offered compensation to survivors of medical experiments, but the amounts were often insultingly small. A few thousand euros cannot compensate for a stolen childhood, for a lifetime of nightmares, for the physical ailments that persisted for decades. In Günzburg, Mengele's hometown, the family maintained silence for decades. His son Rolf met with him once in Brazil in the 1970s and came away convinced his father showed no remorse whatsoever. The family business thrived, becoming one of the largest manufacturers of farm equipment in Germany. They benefited from the family name while Josef Mengele used that same name to torture children. Here's a detail that haunts me. When Mengele's remains were exhumed in 1985, forensic anthropologists noted that he had suffered from chronic back pain in his later years. He'd complained about it in letters. This man, who had inflicted unimaginable pain on thousands, who had performed spinal procedures without anesthesia on children, complained about his own back pain. The complete lack of self-awareness, the total absence of connection between his suffering and the suffering he caused, is almost incomprehensible. His grave in Brazil remains unmarked. There's no headstone, no marker, nothing to indicate who's buried there. This was a deliberate decision to prevent it from becoming either a shrine for neo-Nazis or a target for vandalism. Josef Mengele has no memorial, no recognition, no place where his name is honored, and that's exactly right. But the absence of a grave marker doesn't erase what he did. The children he experimented on, many of whom are buried in mass graves at Auschwitz, or were cremated and their ashes scattered, they have no individual markers either. The difference is that they were innocent victims, and he was their tormentor. History records that Josef Mengele performed experiments on approximately 3,000 twins at Auschwitz. Fewer than 200 survived. That means at least 2,800 children died directly because of his experiments, or were murdered when the experiments concluded. Each one had a name. Each one had a family. Each one had potential that was snuffed out by a man who saw them as nothing more than research material. These weren't statistics. They weren't numbers in a research paper. They were children who liked to play, who had favorite foods, who got scared of the dark, who loved their parents. They were human beings with the same capacity for joy and pain as anyone else. And Josef Mengele systematically destroyed them. His legacy is clear. He represents the absolute corruption of science by ideology. He represents what happens when educated, intelligent people abandon their humanity in service to a dehumanizing belief system. He represents the importance of ethical oversight in medical research, the reason we have institutional review boards and informed consent protocols today. But perhaps most importantly, Josef Mengele represents the danger of intellectual arrogance combined with moral emptiness. He believed he was advancing science. He believed his work had value. He was wrong on every level, but he never acknowledged it. He died believing he'd done nothing wrong, that he was simply a researcher caught on the wrong side of history. The survivors know better. The historical record knows better. The thousands of victims, named and unnamed, their suffering speaks louder than any denial Mengele could have offered. On that beach in Brazil in 1979, as Josef Mengele slipped beneath the waves, the world became slightly less evil. But the ripples of what he did, the trauma he inflicted, the lives he destroyed, those ripples continue to spread. Survivors are still dying, still carrying the physical and psychological scars of what he did to them. Families are still incomplete, still missing the aunts and uncles and cousins who died in Mengele's experiments. Justice, in the traditional sense, was never served. He never stood trial. He never faced his victims. He never heard them testify about what he did. He never spent a single day in prison for his crimes. He lived freely for 34 years after the liberation of Auschwitz and died peacefully, painlessly, quickly. Some would say this is the ultimate injustice, that evil won in Josef Mengele's case. Others would say that his legacy of infamy, the fact that his name is synonymous with medical torture and Nazi cruelty, is its own form of justice. That he's remembered not as a scientist, but as a monster, is the punishment history has given him. But for the survivors, for Eva and Miriam, for Zvi, for the thousands whose names we'll never know, for the twins who died in agony from his experiments, the question of justice remains complicated and painful. They deserved better. They deserved to see him in a courtroom, to see him held accountable, to hear him admit what he'd done. That's his legacy. Not the peaceful death on a Brazilian beach, but the trail of suffering and death he left behind. That's why we remember Josef Mengele. Not to glorify him, not to sensationalize his crimes, but to ensure that the victims are never forgotten and that the conditions that allowed him to exist are never repeated. History will never forget what he did, and more importantly, history will never forget what was done to his victims in the name of science that was no science at all.